Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and again from my side also a great privilege to present to you the BFAP Baseline 2020. In a year where COVID-19 is having a significant impact on the economy, but also on the agriculture sector, we want to present to you an outlook, but also taking a step back and looking at plans that have been made in agriculture. Have these materialized? Should we adjust our growth strategy? What are the opportunities for growth? In this sense, I want to present to a broader context of the agriculture baseline, and more specifically looking at a period where we are now again in a planning phase, what we refer to as the AAMP, the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. And in this master plan, we are asking ourselves the question, can we bend the curve? Can we generate growth? Can we introduce interventions that can take us beyond what we see in the outlook, in the baseline, what the economic activities are and where their potential growth can be? And the short answer, after 2 hours, if you look at the presentation and if you look at our analyses, the conclusion is this, that yes, there are opportunities for growth. And more importantly, there are opportunities for inclusive growth. And if we introduce very specific interventions, and if we ensure that we actually move from plans into actions, the model that we're presenting actually generates growth of about 12% or 11.8% above baseline projections in the outlook period. But these principles that we've introduced in the model actually take us back to the National Development Plan, where we envisaged 1 million jobs to be created in agriculture. And a lot of times media refers to the expansion of 1 million jobs in export-led industries, which is not correct. The model was actually developed on a 3-tier approach where the smallholder sector and underutilized land, investment in our smallholder and informal sector could actually generate about 400,000 jobs. That was the target. Secondly, your tier of export-led industries, the so-called intensive irrigated industries, the contribution was actually only 250,000 jobs. And the expansion in irrigation was not 500,000 hectares. It was actually built on a model of gaining 10% efficiency, in other words, expanding the irrigation area by 140,000 hectares, of which, if we look at the expansion over the last 10 years, we've already expanded 70,000 hectares. And we'll get to that table in a moment. The third tier of growth was actually in agro-processing. In other words, off-farm jobs. And we need to be analytical about this and understand the consequences that agriculture and primary sector cannot create all the jobs and economic growth that we need to achieve. We need to move off-farm and actually move within the value chains and understand how we can unlock further growth within these processing units, within the export units where we have significant jobs to add. So taking just a brief look at a summary of some of these high growth areas that we identified in the initial National Development Plan. And if we look at the targets, the NDP targets that were set for 2030, for example, citrus, the target was set at 15,000 hectares potential expansion. The citrus sector has actually expanded by 23,000 hectares, already exceeding the target of the National Development Plan. In our next session, if we talk about citrus outlook, we will illustrate the implications because there are huge volumes coming into the market. We need market access, we need infrastructure facilities in the ports, roads, etc. Other sectors that have done also well and actually have exceeded growth, some industry like dairy or like pork, that have grown significantly faster than what we've seen in the NDP projection. So in other words, there are sectors where with the correct combination, with the correct incentives, you can actually generate that growth. And if we look at the trade balance, agriculture's net contribution to the trade balance has actually been very positive, faster than the rest of the economy if we take that into consideration. The sector that's really of a concern is the smallholder sector, and we've seen in periods, in this graph you can see specifically 2016 and 2015, the impact of the severe drought on the sector. There's very little resilience, there's very little coordinated support. Although there's a lot of funding flowing into the sector, not nearly enough traction has been gained in the last 10 years where you can actually see an increasing share of output coming from the sector. So this sector has not been performing as what was initially envisaged in the National Development Plan. And then just lastly, the third sector looks at agro-processing. As mentioned, critical sector, about 1/3 of the jobs in the NDP coming from the agro-processing sector. So in other words, already acknowledging the importance of value chains, these end-to-end principles where you have a competitive raw material feeding into a processing unit and delivering a cost-effective product for the retail or the consumer. In most of the cases, low-income households. And if we just analyze growth performance of the agro-processing sector, we can see that in the last 10 years, the sector has actually expanded by a faster rate than manufacturing and the overall manufacturing GDP rate that we've seen in the last 10 years. And that's now in constant terms. This sector has expanded by about 2% per annum over the last 10 years. So if we want to then just summarize all of these sectors and we take a more granular approach towards the National Development Plan, we can actually split it out into formal, informal, and commercial and smallholder. And we see the differences. We have a commercial sector which is largely linked to large-scale operations, and this sector has performed relatively well despite of shocks like your droughts, your avian influenza, your foot and mouth disease, your African swine fever. These were all exogenous shocks having an impact on growth. So if you want to provide a more granular summary of the National Development Plan and the 3 tiers of growth, we can actually split it into smallholder and commercial, into formal and into informal. And on this chart, we're actually showing that the commercialized and the more large-scale operations have performed relatively well, given the external impacts. And what's very interesting, anecdotal evidence shows us that some of these informal value chains, especially in the secondary jobs creators, the informal sectors have actually done better than what we've anticipated. But this is something that where we need a lot more data and a lot more analyses done, and we'll focus on that in a later session during the baseline launch. Another sector that has done exceptionally well are emerging farmers and new entrants into the space that are linked to the public-private partnerships, where you have well-coordinated programs, support services, finance, linking these farmers into markets. And this category has probably grown the fastest of all, but there's not enough in this space, and we need to expand on these success cases. And as already mentioned, the smallholder subsistence and the land reform and underutilized land category, that's where we still have vast tracts of land and also unproductive land where we need to provide more support into these sectors. So taking a step back and considering the socioeconomic environment in South Africa, we have a population that's urbanizing, and we've got a huge number of low-income households that are trapped in urban areas. To the same extent, we also have a high density of poverty in rural areas. In other words, agriculture can play a significant role in rural areas by creating more economic activity, but in the urban spaces, you need the efficient large-scale value chains to provide safe and cost-effective options for low-income households. And if we look at these value chain options, they are very diverse, and we need to consider these options. We cannot have a model where we force all participants into the same value chain. We need solutions for different types of value chains. This is analysis that was done by BFAP about 4 or 5 years ago, where we analyzed the poultry sector. And we looked at the extreme, at the top of the graph, we see smallholder farmers selling a live bird at 50 Rand. Production costs significantly higher than the bottom of the graph, where you actually see contract growers who need to produce a chicken at about 22 Rand a kilo. Cost structures much more lower, but they're delivering it into a much larger commercialized chain where the volumes are bigger and you're facing increasing competition from competitive imports. If we then turn to the farming system, we see the same diverse nature. And we see these numbers coming from the census 2017 that was released in March by Statistics South Africa, where we have 40,000 commercial farmers that are VAT registered. And we see a biggest number of farmers actually being in the medium to small and micro space. Micro is even smaller than turnovers of 2 million rand. But if you look at the job creation and where the biggest employment lies, it's still with the large-scale farmers. And then you get your big numbers in terms of the smallholder farms, where you have about 300,000 small farms and about 2.3 million households that are reporting agriculture activity. So combining farming system and food systems is not something new. And we have seen success cases over the last 10 years, which we refer to as these successful public-private partnerships. And this just gives us an illustration of one of those examples or these models. And this was a jobs fund model or jobs fund project where funding was combined from the public sector and the private sector by the grain industry. And what the two lines are comparing is basically the traditional non-commercial yields that we see coming from the maize farming industry. And if we look at the Crop Estimates Committee, these yields are around about 1.8 to 2 tons per hectare. And if you look in the same farms, if you provide the correct extension services, support, the finances, the markets, the productivity gains are significant. And they're basically doubling their yields, going to about 4 tons per hectare. What's more important out of this picture, however, is on the right-hand side, that these surpluses that are created by the productivity gains are actually flowing into a value chain. So these farmers are producing way beyond what their own household consumption is on the same area. They're actually releasing surpluses into the value chain. And on the right-hand side, the graph shows us that about 44% of these surpluses over the last 4 years actually fed into a value chain where you could see processing, and this is where you can see also the potential for intensification of livestock systems or further processing of products. If we then combine these two principles, and this is a very busy diagram, but if we just keep our focus on these two triangles and we talk about a portfolio approach, and a portfolio approach with a focus to broaden the base and grow the share and output of black participants at all levels of demand and supply. Where you have at the bottom of this diagram on the left, you've got your number of farmers, and on the right-hand side is the volume of food that's produced by that specific category. So to just look at the two extremes, at the bottom, you've got subsistence-orientated smallholders. Their level of support is directly linked to direct government subsidies. And then one step higher, if you're moving into a market-orientated smallholders, linking those into value chains that are already existing, understanding where do we need to improve infrastructure, where do we need to improve finances. And if you look at the right-hand side, as you're moving up into your demand system, the volumes are increasing rapidly. So at the top of the chain, in terms of volumes and requirements, they are very stringent. If we move into export markets, the SPS requirements, traceability requirements, they're just much, much more stringent and a much higher barrier of entry. And that's where the commercialized operations come in and where they have the benefit and they've got the scale and they've got the support from an existing infrastructure that's already there. What's required at that level is market access to a large extent, or infrastructure development, access to water. The important part is that we grow the share of the black farmers and participants throughout the whole value chain. There are preconditions to all of this. These are models that are not new, as I've mentioned before. We need to focus on the preconditions. And again, these are principles that we've debated also, and the evidence is there that these principles are critical before the growth will take place. And the first part is capital. Capital investment in an investment-friendly, policy-certain environment. And again, we need to take the diverse nature of farming systems into consideration. So on the right-hand side, the extreme, for example, we've got orchards. They require more than 800,000 Rand of capital investment, very capital intensive. Some of these operations, like for example macadamias, you only get your returns after 8 or 9 years. On the left-hand side, you have capex and opex requirements of maybe a few hundred rands per hectare. These are extensive sheep operations or goat operations in the Karoo. The yields or the gross margins are very low per hectare. You need big farms. big hectares. Maybe 50 Rand a hectare would be your gross margin. On the right-hand side, you can generate a revenue of 100, 150, 200,000 Rand per hectare. But the type of system, the type of support is completely different. And we need to take that into consideration. Then talking about optimization and coordination of public and private, of the private sector. In the graph, we can clearly see that over the years, your spending of government, the focus and the largest share has been in the provinces where we actually have the highest concentration of smallholders or informal markets. So in other words, there is already funding taking place. And the question is, how can we link this funding into private sector initiatives and into value chains that are already existing, but we need to improve on those and optimize the impacts and the investments that we have in these spaces. And if we talk about resources, we consider the nature of South African climate, the marginal nature of our lands. If we map those, the majority of our land is lying at marginal or low potential land. But the reality remains that there are pockets where we still have irrigation that's not utilized, and a lot of those irrigation schemes are actually sitting with smallholders where there is water allocation done, but it needs an investment. And these areas can easily add up to about 30 to 40,000 hectares of idle irrigation schemes. What we have, we need to use more efficiently. And this is just presenting a picture from flyover data from the Western Cape, because in this province they've done flyovers for 2013 and 17, and we can carefully consider some important efficiency gains that we've seen in the irrigation space. For example, under orchards and shade netting, the area has increased by almost 300%. And if we consider vegetables, tunnels have increased by about 43%. So in other words, there's been a significant efficiency gain in using what we have more efficiently, but it requires investment. Then taking another precondition into consideration is policy support. And we've seen these arguments made a number of times. Tariffs are not in a lot of cases, they're a blunt instrument, but in certain cases, and if it's applied correctly, it can make a difference. And we've seen this in the wheat industry, where we've seen rapid decline in the area under wheat production in the last or previous decade. We're actually seeing hectares have stabilized. Now, the decline initially was largely a result of climate shifts in the Free State area, but also just risk of farming and then your exposure into the global market. We are net importers of wheat, and we will remain net importers of wheat. But there are areas that can remain in production given the current support system. And what this graph is showing with this increased reference pricing, in other words, where we actually have tariff protection, the hectares remain in production, and we actually have a more stable production environment in the winter rainfall areas. In other words, if we take this data into consideration, we need to be honest on what we can do in terms of import replacement and where we have more growth. For example, in the soybean industry, we are gaining ground on soybean imports, soybean meal imports more specifically, where we've had an investment and we're actually growing the industry and reducing the amount of soybean meal that's being imported. However, we have other industries like wheat, where our natural resource potential limits us to become actually self-sufficient in that space. Yes, we can grow yields. We can do it as efficient as possible as our natural resource potential allows us, but we have limited space. We have benefits again where we can have specific interventions, for example, poultry meat, where a significant amount of poultry meat is imported, but through correct interventions and a competitive grain and oilseed industry, we can actually drive down imports of poultry meat. If we then take the same principle and we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, because in the Agriculture Master Plan, there's a lot of anticipation for what the African Free Trade Agreement could bring for us. But if we consider what are the type of products that Africa is importing, and what's interesting, contrary to what's happening in South Africa, where the agriculture and agro-food processing is a net exporter, Africa is a net importer. And if we look at the type of products that are being imported, it leans towards processed, highly processed product. And then obviously, again, your rice, your wheat are major imported products, as well as palm oil or vegetable oil at large. And there are again opportunities for this region to grow more of it locally, but not only at primary level, but understanding what the interventions and investments need to be in the value chain to create that pull off the farm, to create jobs and revenue on the off-farm basis. Lastly, talking about climate change. Such an important element, and it has to speak to all of our research and development programs that we run, the cultivar trials, the investment in genetics. And this graph just presents us the last 120 years of rainfall in the Northwest province. And this is a province, or the western part of the country, where we've seen significant shifts, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, where we've had way below rainfall, and we can see that on the right-hand side of the chart, way below the average of the last 100 years. And this has really influenced a lot of the production patterns in the area. That's influenced the herd sizes, and this is pointing also towards the future in terms of availability of irrigation, availability of farmland, and making sure that we can actually establish new farmers in this space where you already have climate change happening, which a lot of times in certain areas marginalizes your potential for profitable operations. And this then links to our big data generation. And this trial is specifically referring to latest results where BFAP's working with a consortium, a research consortium, and it's showing trial data where you actually have precision planters, precision harvesting equipment. And through this equipment and data, we can actually optimize an understanding of modeling between yield, for example, and fertilizer application, the seeding rates, where traditional research plots would give you maybe 10 observations. With this new technique, you can actually drive 2,400, 2,500 observations, and you can build far more robust models. I want to conclude this section by just summarizing our preconditions for inclusive growth and development. 4 main areas, and these 4 main areas need to be combined by efficient and coordinated institutions and departments. And by departments, we refer also to the 3 tiers of government, your national versus provincial versus municipal government. In other words, the harmony between and the coordinated vision between these different spheres. And if we just summarize these 4 areas, these 4 preconditions, firstly, investments, and we're talking about a investment-friendly environment, whether it's security of land ownership, water, safety at farm level, looking at the support and innovation component, the second precondition, specifically finance, policy support, effective extension services, R&D, information systems that need to be in place. The third tier, infrastructure, we're specifically referring to roads, electricity, fresh produce markets that need to work efficiently for the smaller scale farmers to deliver into these markets. Water infrastructure, port facilities that need to take the produce out that's being produced locally. And then lastly, your markets. Increased market access. We need to be nimble with our market access strategy, bilateral trade agreements, agreeing with industry, between industry and government, what are the priorities. And they are great examples of fruit industry roundtables, vegetable industry roundtables, working together and identifying key areas of growth. I want to conclude this context then just by restating the opportunity for agriculture, where you actually have an opportunity for growth above the baseline that we will see in the next section, where we can invest and we can coordinate in a way that will benefit the industry at large.